When you picture the Middle Ages, what comes to mind? Castles, knights, kings, queens, maybe even monks praying in silence. You might think it was a time of strict rules, where people lived holy, quiet lives. But the truth? Medieval sex lives were anything but quiet. Behind the stone walls of castles and the wooden doors of peasant huts, people were experimenting with practices so strange, so bizarre, that many sound unbelievable today. This wasn't just about love or lust. It was about power, superstition, and survival. Imagine a young couple being forced to climb into bed together while priests, nobles, and even family members stood in the room to watch. Or villagers eating animal organs at weddings because they believed it would make them more passionate on the wedding night. Picture priests selling magic belts to women who prayed for fertility, or kings timing their bedroom activities by the phases of the moon. It sounds outrageous, but for people in the Middle Ages, these practices were serious business. They believed sex could bring blessings or curses, that it could heal the body or doom the soul. And while some of these customs might make you laugh, others reveal the deep fears and desires that shaped their entire world. Buckle up. Because today, we're stepping into a side of medieval life that history books rarely mention: the bizarre, shocking, and downright unbelievable sexual practices of the Middle Ages. Now you might be wondering, why does any of this matter? Why should we care about what people were doing in their bedrooms hundreds of years ago? Because in the Middle Ages, sex wasn't just a private act. It wasn't only about pleasure. It was tied to almost everything in life: religion, law, money, and even politics. Think about it. Marriage wasn't usually about love. It was about property, alliances, and power. Who you slept with could decide who inherited land, who became the next king, or whether two families stayed united or went to war. A single night in bed could literally change the future of an entire kingdom. The church also played a massive role. Priests and bishops wanted to control every detail of people's lives, right down to when, how, and with whom they could have sex. They made long lists of rules, forbidding intimacy on Sundays, during Lent, on feast days, even during certain phases of the moon. Break those rules, and you weren't just a sinner. You were putting your soul at risk. And then there was superstition. With little real science to guide them, people turned to magic, charms, and strange rituals. They swallowed bizarre potions, wore blessed underwear, and trusted in astrology to decide the right night to conceive. To them, these weren't jokes. They were life and death choices about fertility, family, and salvation. When we talk about medieval sexual practices, we're not just gossiping about weird bedroom habits. We're looking at how an entire society tried to control something as basic and powerful as human desire. And as you're about to see, the ways they did it were shocking, often disturbing, and sometimes just plain unbelievable. Let's start with how couples in the Middle Ages actually courted each other. Forget candlelight dinners or romantic walks. Their traditions were far stranger. One of the most bizarre was something called bundling. Here's how it worked. When a young man came to visit a girl he was interested in, her parents would literally tie him up. Yes, they would wrap him in a sack, or sometimes sew him into a long blanket, leaving only his head sticking out. Then, they'd place him in bed right next to their daughter. The idea was simple. The two could talk, maybe cuddle a little, but he couldn't actually do anything else because his arms and legs were trapped. Parents believed this was a safe way for young people to get to know each other before marriage. In reality, you can imagine that curious teenagers always found creative ways around the rules. Records from the time show that pregnancies still happened, which suggests bundling wasn't as foolproof as parents hoped. In some regions, they added a wooden plank or a board between the boy and girl, almost like an ancient chastity barrier. But again, people being people, the rules didn't always hold. Church leaders were horrified. Priests preached against bundling, saying it tempted couples into sin. But it continued anyway, especially in rural villages, because parents saw it as a practical way to test compatibility without sending their daughters into the dark with a stranger. To us today, it sounds absurd, sewing a boy into a sack just to control him. But for medieval families, this was deadly serious. Marriage wasn't about romance. It was about reputation, alliances, and survival. And if tying someone up in a bag for the night seemed to protect a family's honor, then that's exactly what they did. If bundling was strange, Wait until you hear what medieval people were eating to heat things up. In the Middle Ages, food wasn't just about filling your stomach. People truly believed certain meals could spark desire and improve fertility. These were called aphrodisiacs, foods thought to boost passion. And let me tell you, their recipes were anything but ordinary. At weddings, it was common to serve dishes made from animal organs. Rooster testicles, rabbit kidneys, even the brains of tiny birds like sparrows were considered powerful. Why? Because people thought eating the reproductive parts of animals would somehow pass those same powers onto humans, and it didn't stop there. Spices like cinnamon, ginger, and cloves were mixed into wine to create lust potions. Medieval medical texts actually listed these ingredients as treatments for a cold body, their way of describing low desire. For wealthy nobles, feasts sometimes looked like magical rituals. Banquets would include oysters, eels, and even exotic imports like saffron, which was incredibly expensive. Eating these foods wasn't just about pleasure. It was a public display, showing that a lord or lady was fertile, healthy, and ready to produce heirs. Even doctors of the time joined in. Some recommended a stew made of onions and leeks for men, claiming it would give them stamina. Women, meanwhile, were told to drink wine boiled with herbs like parsley or fennel. Of course, none of this had real science behind it. But in a world without modern medicine, people grabbed onto whatever hope they could find. And when family honor depended on producing children, no ritual felt too strange to us. Oh, while today we might laugh at the idea of eating bird brains to set the mood, in the Middle Ages, a wedding banquet wasn't complete without a dish or two designed to fan the flames of passion. If aphrodisiac feasts weren't strange enough, let's talk about what happened after the wedding banquet. In the Middle Ages, marriage wasn't considered official until it was physically consummated. And shockingly, this wasn't always a private moment. For noble families and royalty, the first night together was treated almost like a ceremony. The couple would be escorted to the marriage bed by family members, priests, or even political allies. The room would be filled with witnesses, sometimes sitting in chairs, sometimes standing at the foot of the bed, waiting for the act to begin. In some traditions, the priest would bless the bed, sprinkle holy water, and give the couple a short prayer before stepping back. Then, while the bride and groom climbed under the sheets, the onlookers were expected to stay quiet, but present. Manuals from the time actually described how long witnesses should remain. Some advised staying until satisfactory signs were observed. And if that sounds uncomfortable, it gets even stranger. In certain regions, the couple's bedsheets were later inspected for proof that the marriage had truly been sealed. The presence or absence of stains could decide whether the union was valid. In royal marriages, this could affect dynasties and inheritance claims. For the people involved, this wasn't romance, it was duty. Families wanted undeniable evidence that their alliance had been secured, that heirs would be born, and that reputations were safe. To us today, the idea of being watched on your wedding night is shocking, almost unthinkable. But for medieval nobles, it was just another part of the bargain. Love and privacy mattered far less than honor and politics. So, while the couple might have hoped for intimacy, what they got instead was an audience, turning their most private moment into a public performance. In the Middle Ages, even the timing of sex wasn't left to chance. People believed the stars, the calendar, and even the direction of the bed could decide whether a couple conceived a healthy child or committed a sin. Astrology played a huge role. Couples often consulted astrologers before trying to have children. Certain phases of the moon were considered lucky for conception, while others were believed to produce weak or sickly babies. If Mars was in the wrong position, some thought a child might be born violent or cursed. The church also had its own rules, and they were strict. According to medieval teaching, sex was forbidden on Sundays, feast days, during Lent, Advent, and on the eve of important holy days. Add it all up, and nearly half the year was off limits. Imagine being married but told that 183 days of the calendar were sinful for intimacy. It didn't stop there. Couples were also told their bed should face east, toward Jerusalem, to ensure divine blessing. Facing west, toward the setting sun, was said to invite darkness into the marriage, and when couples struggled to conceive, things became even stranger. Families sometimes hired fertility consultants, a mix of priests, physicians, and astrologers to calculate the exact night when intimacy would be most effective. They would prescribe prayers, specific foods, and even recommend which planetary hour to try. Of course, none of this had any real scientific basis. But in a world without modern medicine, people were desperate for guidance. They believed the heavens held answers that could shape their families and futures. To us today, it sounds overcomplicated, like turning intimacy into a math problem. But for medieval couples, the stars in the church calendar controlled not just their days, but even their nights. When medieval people struggled with fertility, they often turned to something that sounds almost comical today: magical clothing and charms. One of the strangest examples was the girdle of Venus. This was basically a special belt or band that women would wear around their waist, often decorated with symbols or stitched prayers. Some were blessed by priests, others were said to carry magical powers. The belief was simple: wear the belt, and it would help you conceive a child. But that wasn't all. Rich women sometimes owned girdles made of silk or even embroidered with threads of gold. Poorer women, who couldn't afford such luxuries, tried to copy the idea with homemade versions: strips of cloth with charms or little crosses sewn into them. Whether rich or poor, the hope was the same: that a piece of fabric could tip the scales of fate. And the magical underwear didn't stop at belts. Some women wore blessed undergarments or carried amulets shaped like unicorn horns, believed to drive away infertility. Others placed special stones under the bed or sprinkled holy water directly on the sheets. Priests were even known to bless these items, proof that superstition and religion often worked hand in hand. To us, this might sound silly, but in a world where childbirth was dangerous and infant mortality was high, people were desperate. Producing heirs wasn't just personal, it was a family's survival, reputation, and honor. So if a girdle, an amulet, or even a blessed bedsheet offered hope, people clung to it. These charms show us just how deeply fear and faith were woven together in medieval life. When medicine failed and prayers seemed unanswered, sometimes the only comfort left was a piece of cloth tied around the waist. Now here's one of the most humiliating practices of the Middle Ages: the impotence trial. In a society where marriage was all about producing children, a husband who couldn't perform wasn't just seen as unlucky, he could actually be dragged into court. And the process was brutal. If a wife claimed her husband couldn't satisfy her or give her children, judges sometimes ordered a public investigation. That meant the couple had to prove, in front of officials or even hired witnesses, whether the husband was truly capable. Imagine the embarrassment: having strangers essentially evaluate your most private life. Records describe how men were sometimes forced to undergo physical examinations by midwives or physicians, who would check their bodies for signs of weakness. In extreme cases, the couple was actually ordered to have intercourse under supervision, with officials waiting outside the room to confirm if it happened. For the men, this was terrifying. Their honor, their marriage, even their property could be lost if they were judged impotent. Some tried to cheat the system, smuggling in medieval versions of Viagra, or using charms and potions to boost their performance during the trial. But it wasn't just the men who faced pressure. Women could also be questioned in detail about their experiences. Judges and priests would ask shocking, invasive questions about how the husband touched her, whether she felt pleasure, or how often attempts were made. The outcome of these trials could ruin lives. If a man was declared impotent, his marriage could be annulled, his reputation destroyed, and his wife free to remarry. In a society built on honor, there were few greater shames. To us today, the idea sounds almost absurd. But in the Middle Ages, impotence wasn't just a personal problem. It was a matter of law, religion, and public scandal. When we think of the medieval church, we imagine monks chanting prayers or bishops preaching about sin. But here's the shocking truth: in many places, the very same church that condemned lust was also running brothels. Yes, you heard that right. By the late Middle Ages, some bishops and church officials actually owned or controlled houses of prostitution. Their justification was strange, but, to them, logical. They argued that men's desires couldn't be stopped, and if those urges weren't managed, worse sins like adultery or assault would spread. So, they claimed, It was better to allow controlled brothels than to let chaos reign. In cities like London and Paris, official brothels were sometimes located right near church property. Records even show bishops collecting rent and taxes from these establishments. That money, believe it or not, often went into the very institutions that preached morality: monasteries, cathedrals, even hospitals. To ordinary people, the hypocrisy was glaring. How could priests condemn lust on Sunday, then profit from it on Monday? But for the church, it was a practical matter of power and control. By regulating sex work, they not only made money, they also kept a tight grip on society's desires. Inside these brothels, rules were surprisingly strict. Women had to be unmarried, customers were usually limited to local men, and prices were regulated by officials. It was, in a twisted way, organized sin blessed by authority. Of course, not everyone approved. Reformers and preachers often attacked the practice, saying it corrupted the soul of the church. But the system lasted for centuries, showing just how deeply tangled money, power, and sex were in the medieval world. While priests thundered against immorality in public, behind the scenes, the church was quietly cashing in on the very behavior it claimed to fight. So, what do all these bizarre practices really tell us about the Middle Ages? It's easy to laugh at the idea of bundling a boy in a sack, or eating bird brains to feel passionate, or wearing magical underwear for fertility. To us, these things sound silly, even absurd. But to medieval people, they weren't jokes. They were survival. Sex in that world wasn't just private pleasure. It was tied to inheritance, religion, and the future of entire families. A failed marriage could ruin reputations. A childless couple could lose their land. A single accusation of impotence could end in public shame. Every act in the bedroom carried weight far beyond the walls of a home. And because real science didn't exist, people leaned on superstition, tradition, and the authority of the church. Whether it was charms, rituals, or forbidden calendars, they clung to anything that offered hope or control. In their eyes, these weren't bizarre mistakes. They were the only tools they had. But there's also a darker truth here. These practices reveal just how much power the church and ruling classes had over ordinary people's most intimate lives. From blessing girdles to profiting off brothels, from forbidding sex on holy days to inspecting wedding sheets, authority reached even into the most private corners of human existence. And maybe that's the real lesson. Human desire never changes. People will always look for ways to express it, control it, or bend it to their needs. What changes is the system around them, the rules, the fears, and the strange solutions they invent. The next time you think of the Middle Ages as a world of knights and castles, remember this. Behind those stone walls were people just as desperate, just as passionate, and just as strange as us. Because history isn't clean. It isn't polite. It's bizarre, brutal, and very, very human.